Hello, everybody. So glad to see you all here. Such a pleasure. And I appreciate the degree to which our Scientists and Strategists series has been increasing in numbers of attendees. I think we're succeeding in bringing together parts of the university to talk to each other, both on the science and engineering side on the one hand, and the policymakers and social scientists on the other hand. So that is our purpose. And I'm super excited that we have a wonderful speaker today in our Scientists and Strategists event, who I'll tell you a little bit more about. But before I get too far along, let me wish everyone here a happy Lunar New Year. I'm Audrey Kurth-Cronin. I'm the Trustees Professor of Security and Technology and Director of the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, or CMIST. At CMIST, we focus on the smart development, use, and governance of emerging technologies that are reshaping the landscape of war and peace. So this Scientists and Strategists speaker series is an opportunity for scientists and engineers to come together with strategists and policymakers for in-person discussions that elucidate concepts that are of importance to both. In the past, we've explored a wide range of topics. You can find all of these on our website, and I strongly encourage you to go back and look at some of the earlier talks, from the impact of innovative technologies to the ongoing fight for gender equality in STEM. Today, we're privileged to welcome Dr. Matthew Fuhrmann, the Cullen McFadden Professor of Political Science at Texas A&M University. An esteemed scholar and prolific researcher, Dr. Fuhrmann specializes in international security, focusing on nuclear weapons, diplomacy, bargaining, and alliance politics, some of the most pressing and impactful issues of our day. His academic journey includes prestigious appointments as a visiting professor at Yale University and Stanford University, as well as notable and very difficult to get fellowships, such as his time as a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., and as a research fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. In 2016, Dr. Fuhrmann was named an Andrew Carnegie Now that's a mistake. It's so hard to separate the Carnegie from the Mellon for me. I'm sorry. He was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a testament to the groundbreaking impact of his work. Dr. Fuhrmann is also a celebrated author of 3 very influential and highly praised books. His most recent work, Influence Without Arms, you see the picture right up there, ta-da, is what we will be mainly talking about today. Influence Without Arms, the New Logic of Nuclear Deterrence. And it explains how nuclear latency shapes world politics in important ways. And it's already garnered a tremendous amount of attention, and he will explain to you what nuclear latency means in just a minute. Scott Sagan at Stanford University has said of this book, Influence Without Arms is the most sophisticated study to date of how a state's ability to build nuclear weapons in the near future impacts its behavior and that of its rivals today. But perhaps the highest praise comes from one of Dr. Fuhrmann's youngest and most devoted fans, his daughter, who reports that the book, and I'm quoting her here, is a good book because it explains deterrence in ways I don't understand because there are a lot of words I cannot read. I've never read the book before. It seems very boring, but also a very good book. Let me just say that it is not boring, and it is an excellent book. It's a ringing endorsement there, if ever I've heard one. Dr. Fuhrmann's articles grace the pages of leading journals like American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, and International Security, to name just a few. And his work also inspires the next generation of scholars and practitioners in this critical field. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Matthew Fuhrmann.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Audrey, for that very warm introduction. My daughter, Adrienne, who's 9 now, but was 8 when she wrote that, is just going to be thrilled when I tell her that her endorsement got read at my introduction. Really excited to see you all. Thank you for being here. As Audrey said, I'm going to talk to you about my new book, Influence Without Arms. But before I get into that, I wanted to take a step back and just tell you a little bit about the kinds of questions and issues that get me really excited as a scholar. Because this book is a more specific take on what I see as a broader series of issues that interest me. So to set this up, let's talk about this machine here, which is called a lithotripter. If you've ever had kidney stones, you might be familiar with this machine because hospitals use it to break up kidney stones so that they can be passed easier. This machine relies on an item called a triggered spark gap to release energy in order to break up the kidney stones. Well, it also turns out that the same triggered spark gap that you use in this lithotripter is also what you need to detonate a nuclear explosion. So this triggered spark gap is an example of what we call a dual-use commodity or a dual-use technology because it has both commercial implications or health implications, any kind of civilian application, as well as potential use for a military technology, in this case, nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, when Iraq had a nuclear weapons program, Saddam Hussein procured 6 lithotripters, along with dozens of spark gaps to go with those. Now, was Iraq trying to become a leading center for the treatment of people with kidney stones? Perhaps. That was the publicly given justification, but we all suspected that his motivations were more on the nuclear weapons side. But because the technology is indistinguishable, it can be difficult to know what the aims are. We see this not just in the nuclear realm, but when it comes to lots of technologies. So for example, if you think about a Reaper drone, so much of what it takes to build a Reaper drone is dual-use technology. Or if we think about AI, obviously there are civilian applications as well as military applications. So the thing that got me really excited to pursue a PhD in political science was thinking about this dual-use dilemma. What do we do, or what happens in a situation where we have technologies that have both peaceful and military uses? I think this raises some really broad questions that I've tried to tackle in various ways in my research. One of them is, if you're a producer of these dual-use technologies, do you export them, or do you try to control them? And if you do try to control them, how do you do that? There's interesting tension here between economic potential and national security. And I find it interesting to explore how different governments grapple with that trade-off. I'm also interested in thinking about the political effects that arise from trade in dual-use technologies, whether they're nuclear or whether they're conventional dual-use technologies. And then thinking about dual-use capabilities as a potential source of military power and influence. In other words, what are the commercial sources of military power for countries? In thinking about these questions broadly, the approach I take is an interdisciplinary one because I think in order to tackle these questions, we have to know something about the politics, but we also have to know something about the technology and the science. So in my work, I've done a lot of collaboration with engineers over the last 13 years or so, trying to understand how different nuclear technologies carry implications for peace and stability. And when you're studying these kinds of issues, a lot of times there's not existing data that's readily available. So what you end up having to do is to collect your own data and find creative ways to study these issues in a systematic way. And so I've tried to do that in my research, both in the nuclear realm, but also with drones. So Josh Schwartz is in the audience. He and I, along with Mike Horowitz, have collected data on drone diffusion in recent years. So with that as kind of a backdrop, today I'm going to focus on the book, which is about a particular kind of dual-use technology, specifically sensitive nuclear technology, which is technology that can be used to make fissile material, plutonium or weapons-grade highly enriched uranium. These technologies have important commercial applications. If you can make highly enriched uranium, or if you can enrich uranium at all, you can make fuel for nuclear power plants and produce electricity. But then you can also make the most important ingredient for a nuclear bomb. There's three main steps to make a nuclear bomb. You have to obtain the fissile material, number one. Number two, you have to weaponize the fissile material. And number three, you have to put the weaponized fissile material on some kind of delivery system, which is often a missile. Of those three steps, the most difficult is getting the material in the first place. So once you have enough weapons-grade highly enriched uranium or plutonium for a bomb, you are very far along in the process. So what this means is that countries that have this capability have a massive head start if they ever decide to launch a nuclear weapons program. There's different kinds of technologies that can be used to make these materials. On the right-hand side there, you're looking at a centrifuge facility. These are centrifuges from Iran. This is a common approach that's used by several countries today to enrich uranium. On the left, that's a new uranium enrichment facility in Brazil. So you have lots of countries, historically and now today, that are investing in these technologies. What I want to understand in the book is what implications that carries for international security. As a starting place, we might think to look at the literature in political science and the social sciences more generally on nuclear technology and how it affects war and peace and stability. There's been a lot of great work in this space, and I've included some covers of books from the Cold War as well as more recently that focus on this issue. All of this work, though, is focused on nuclear programs that have produced assembled weapons. And at least an implicit assumption in all this work is that to get any kind of international leverage from a nuclear program, you have to, at a minimum, have assembled at least one warhead, one weapon. Most of this work doesn't take seriously the possibility that you might be able to get some international leverage from having the underlying dual-use technology to be able to build a bomb, even if you don't go all the way and do it. And that's what I'm trying to get at in this book. Throughout the nuclear age, there's been 33 countries that have had at various points in time a program to produce enriched uranium or plutonium. And these 33 countries had programs of this nature of varying scales and degrees. Japan's an example of a country today that has nuclear latency. And when I say latency, I mean these are countries that have the capability to build nuclear weapons because of their underlying nuclear energy programs, if they wanted to, but have so far not gone down that path. So journalists sometimes say that Japan is just a screwdriver's turn away from a bomb. But Japan is by no means alone. As I said, more than 30 countries have achieved this capability throughout the nuclear age. The graph here is based on data that I collected for the book on the number of countries that have nuclear latency compared to the number of states that have built nuclear weapons over time. And you can see that in almost every year of the nuclear age, the number of countries with latency far exceeds the states that actually have the weapons. Now, the book develops and unpacks a specific idea about nuclear latency, which I call latent nuclear deterrence. And latent nuclear deterrence at the most basic level involves using a non-weaponized nuclear program to try and get international political influence. Now, it might seem crazy to suggest that you could get international influence and engage in deterrence if you don't have any nuclear weapons. But actually, when you look at policymakers and government officials who have thought about this issue, you find some of them who express confidence that this is possible. And I've given you one example here from Mohammed al-Bardai, who was Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. He said, if you're really smart, you don't need to develop a weapon, you just develop the capability. And that is the best deterrence. So what he's saying here is, with nuclear latency, not weapons, you can obtain some of the same benefits that you get from going all the way to the bomb. And what I want to do in this book is unpack this idea and see if it's actually correct. There's 5 main takeaways that I want to leave you with from the talk today. The first is that world leaders from a diverse set of countries have repeatedly tried to gain international leverage from their nuclear latency. The second key takeaway is that many of these leaders believe that this is an effective strategy, that it works, that using nuclear latency does indeed confer greater political leverage. Third, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the theory of latent deterrence developed in the book that'll help you understand how this is possible and why it could actually work. Fourth, I'll show you some evidence showing that it does work, but only sometimes, because there's certain conditions you have to meet in order for this to be successful. And then I'll conclude with the 5th takeaway, which is that these findings matter for some really important policy issues facing the United States and the world today. So let's take these one at a time. I'll start with the first point, which is that leaders try to use nuclear latency to gain political leverage. And I'm just going to walk you through 3 quick examples. The book unpacks many other stories along these lines, but this is just meant to give you a flavor of how countries have gone about this in the past and today. So first, I'm showing you a statement from an anonymous official in the Ministry of Defense in Japan, who said, quote, if a North Korean missile, even one with no nuclear component, hits Japanese soil, I think the process of building nuclear weapons will begin. So what that official is trying to do is to deter a North Korean missile attack by suggesting that if that happens, this is going to exacerbate Japan's national security threats and cause Japan to build nuclear weapons, which is an outcome that North Korea would not want. And so the Japanese official here is hoping that the prospects of imposing costs in that way would dissuade North Korea from attacking in the first place. Another example comes from the case of Iran. This is former Iranian President Rafsanjani, who once said, quote, once we have mastery of the fuel cycle, meaning once we have nuclear latency, as I'm defining it, all our neighbors will draw the proper conclusion. To dare to attack Iran would be foolhardy. So he's expressing confidence in this idea that Iran doesn't need a nuclear weapon in order to deter attacks. It can do this with mere nuclear latency. The third story comes from North Korea. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. But before that, there was a period where American delegations were sent to North Korea and engaged in some behind-the-scenes diplomacy. On one of these trips, Siegfried Hecker, the former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is where the first atomic bombs were assembled in the United States during World War II, was part of the American delegation visiting North Korea. And he and his colleagues were taken to North Korea's plutonium production facility. And while there, Hecker was literally presented with a glass jar containing North Korean plutonium. Now, because it was in the glass jar, it was shielded from any kind of radiation exposure, but Hecker, picking up the jar, could tell by its weight and the fact that it was emitting heat that it was indeed plutonium. After this, then, he was meeting with a North Korean official who said to him, well, now you have seen our deterrent. But they hadn't seen a deterrent in the traditional sense. They hadn't seen any missiles. They hadn't seen any actual nuclear weapons. All they saw is that North Korea knew how to make plutonium. But the North Koreans apparently believed that this was enough to send a message to Washington and to influence their behavior. So 3 examples here just meant to give you a flavor of how countries try to use having nuclear latency to get more leverage. Well, we know leaders try this. Leaders try all sorts of stuff. It doesn't mean it's effective. So the next natural question is does it work? And the first part of knowing whether it works is to try and tease out what leaders actually think about the efficacy of this strategy. So in the book, there's a lot of historical evidence from declassified documents, both on the US side, from countries like Brazil as well, to try and get at this issue. I'm just going to give you a flavor again of some of the evidence here. So first, let's go to Brazil. Lots of evidence from Brazilian government documents that officials in that country believed in this idea of latent nuclear deterrence. Here's one example from a formerly secret Brazilian National Security Council document from the late 70s that concluded that nuclear latency, quote, increases the political and economic bargaining power of the country. So again, it's this idea that even if you don't have weapons, if you have the underlying technology, you can gain political benefits from this. Here we have 2 former Japanese defense ministers, both expressing confidence in the idea of latent deterrence. One said that nuclear latency has, quote, very great defensive deterrent functions. Another said that Japan's nuclear program provides a tacit nuclear deterrent. The Spanish case is interesting to me for many reasons. One of them is that it's not widely studied among American scholars. So the fact that Spain flirted with nuclear weapons is, I think, not very well known in US scholarship. So for the book, I tried to take a deep dive on this case because I think it's an interesting one and one that's not well known that sheds light on some of these dynamics. So just like in the other cases, here we see evidence that Spanish officials, as they were developing a nuclear energy program that included a reprocessing capability, that they thought that this, even without having any weapons, represented a powerful deterrent, particularly against North African countries, which at the time Spain was worried about potential conflict from countries in North Africa. So again, we see similar evidence along these lines in the 10 cases that I look at in the book to try and suss out leaders' beliefs. So let me now tell you a little bit more about why this is possible, because it might not seem intuitive. It was not intuitive to me at the outset of this project, why exactly nuclear latency would confer political leverage. So one of the things I'm trying to do is a theoretical brush clearing exercise to think through the mechanisms by which this could work. And the book identifies 3 main mechanisms, which I call deterrence by proliferation, delayed attack, and doubt. They all have something in common, which is that they're practiced by states that don't actually have nuclear weapons, but they have the capability to potentially do it. But they vary in some important ways. So in deterrence by proliferation, you're not threatening to use a nuclear weapon. You're threatening merely to possess one, which could be used at some point in the future. So the punishment there is not a traditional nuclear attack. It's just that you're going to proliferate, and you're going to arm with nuclear weapons. Now, here, there's, of course, going to be a delay in punishment because it's going to take you some time to weaponize from the moment you make the threat. Deterrence by delayed attack is very similar to traditional nuclear deterrence in the sense that you are threatening to use nuclear weapons in an attack. But the key difference is that the attack would be delayed because you wouldn't necessarily have the capability to respond immediately since you don't possess nuclear weapons. But if you're close enough to getting the bomb, you could do it quickly and then use it. So just imagine, as a hypothetical thought experiment, that Japan knew prior to the Pearl Harbor attack that if it carried out that attack, what would ultimately happen is that 2 of its cities would be bombed with nuclear weapons. If Japan had hypothetically known that in advance, might it have been deterred from attacking? And you can argue that maybe it would have been. So if a country's at the point where it can get a weapon quickly, that can have deterrence effects, even if they're not yet in possession of the weapon. So in terms of a more contemporary case, what if Ukraine had been a latent nuclear power, and Russia understood that if it invaded, Ukraine could assemble a crude nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks or a couple months? Well, that war is still going on. That war has lasted, in this hypothetical example, longer than it would have taken Ukraine to assemble a weapon. And so it could have had effects on Russia. But the problem for Ukraine is that it was and is too far away from a nuclear weapon, given its lack of any kind of enrichment or reprocessing capability. Deterrence by doubt, which is the third mechanism, happens when a country gets so close to a nuclear weapon that you can't really know for sure what exactly they have. We saw this with India and Pakistan in the 1980s, where we knew they were very close to a nuclear weapon. How close, we weren't so sure. But there came a moment when we couldn't rule out the possibility that they had already assembled a weapon. So I think Iran is getting close to this point. I don't think it's quite there yet, but it's close to where we know they've done a lot of work. We know there's interest. We don't know exactly for sure, with 100% certainty, what they have. And so a moment may come when, if you think there's a chance that Iran could be nuclear armed already, that could also have deterrent effects, even if they're in fact not nuclear armed. So these are the three mechanisms. What I try and do in the book is unpack when they're likely to be successful. And to do this, I take a two-step approach. First, I identify some of the major challenges that come with latent deterrence. And then I, secondly, try and think through whether those challenges can be addressed. And that helps me identify the conditions that would need to be in place in order for this to be an effective strategy. So what are the problems? There's three big ones for countries trying this strategy. One is that punishment is delayed. And anytime punishment is delayed, this provides opportunities for potential aggressors to believe that they can escape punishment, because they might have opportunities to stop the defender before the defender could inflict the threatened punishment. A second big problem is that there's high implementation costs associated with this. Of course, using nuclear weapons would be incredibly costly, both for the target but also for the user of those weapons. But also, proliferating is costly too. And so this can cause other countries to sometimes question the credibility of the threats. So think about the Japan example I showed you involving North Korea. North Korean officials might have questioned whether Japan would actually arm with nuclear weapons, given the costs that would carry for Japan, including straining the alliance with the United States, domestic political costs potentially, economic sanctions that might ensue. And so if you're a country that's engaged in this strategy, you have to make sure that your threats are credible. And when the costs of carrying them out are perceived to be very high, that can present a problem for you. A third problem, which is a big one, is that even attempting this strategy can incite instability, because it can cause countries to worry about your intentions. We have seen military attacks, historically, that have been driven by a concern that a country's going to build nuclear weapons. So if you are attempting this strategy, you have to be wary of the potential for military or political blowback against you. So this is by no means a risk-free strategy. It comes with a lot of potential for blowback. So how can countries potentially address these threats? Firstly, I argue that they need to have operational sensitive nuclear plants, meaning plants that are producing enriched uranium or plutonium. And this is because they have to be quite close to a bomb. If you're a couple of years or more away, that's too long of a time frame to have a big deterrent effect. And so you're going to really weaken the value of that deterrent. But if you're closer, like countries typically are when they're operating large-scale enrichment or reprocessing facilities, then you have more of a hope of addressing that first challenge. In terms of the high implementation cost issue, if the stakes are higher, that's generally going to make the threat seem more believable or more credible. And then in terms of addressing the problem of instability, here, the key is to try and reassure others that your intentions are peaceful. That is, that you're not racing to build nuclear weapons. If you're seen as having a Manhattan Project, like the United States had during World War II, that's a recipe for inciting instability. So by contrast, countries that are able to credibly convey that they're not bent on arming with nuclear weapons, but they're nonetheless possessing the dual-use technology needed to do so, these are the ones that are going to have the most success addressing this third challenge. So when we put all this together, what we conclude is that countries, when they have sensitive nuclear technology in high-stakes situations, should be able to gain some political influence over both allies and adversaries, especially if they can credibly demonstrate nuclear restraint. So these are the core ideas that I try and test in the book. And I'm going to show you some of the evidence just to give you a sense of what it looks like. For this project, I worked with a nuclear engineer at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Gerald Coles, and the mathematician and nuclear engineer Paul Nelson, my colleague from Texas A&M. The three of us sought out to produce a comprehensive, publicly available database of all uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing facilities globally. And we got funding from the Department of Energy to do this. After multiple years of collecting data, we identified almost 250 sites in 33 different countries where some kind of enrichment or reprocessing had taken place. And the database includes a lot of detail about the nature of what was done at these sites. This then serves as the basis for a lot of the empirical analysis I do in the book. Because if you remember back to the previous slide, one of the key things that you need is an operational enrichment or reprocessing plant. So this helps me identify the countries that achieve that capability. Now I'm going to tell you about one context that I look at empirically, but the book looks at other contexts as well. And the context I'm going to show you the most evidence on here looks at the foreign policy preferences of rivals. So what I'm trying to do here is to understand if you have two countries who are rivals and one of them gets nuclear latency, what does that do to the foreign policy of the other state? And in particular, does that other state pursue a more accommodating foreign policy towards the latent power, or do they pursue a more hostile foreign policy towards that state? So to do this, I assemble a data set that has all pairs of rivals from 1946 to 2010. And the main outcome, or dependent variable that I'm looking at here, is the similarity of the foreign policy preferences of these two rivals. And this is based on a widely used measure in political science, which is a measure of a latent concept using data on voting patterns in the United Nations. So the idea is that as foreign policies become more divergent, less congruent, we should see that reflected in the ways that countries are voting at the UN. The key explanatory variables here are, first, whether they have an enrichment or reprocessing capability, and second, whether or not they are showing nuclear restraint. That is, whether they are seen by others as being bent on building nuclear weapons or not. Now, I'm going to do a statistical analysis here where I'm going to use matching and weighting methods. And the idea here, just at the conceptual level, is to say, we know what happens to the congruence of foreign policy interests among these two rivals when one state gets latency. What we can observe and what we don't know is what would have happened in a counterfactual world where latency didn't happen. So to generate that counterfactual, which is critical for estimating an effect, I'm going to use these matching and weighting methods. And I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A if people are interested. What these methods allow me to do is to estimate what happens in subsequent years after one state gets nuclear latency. What does that do in the next year and the year after that in terms of the foreign policy congruence or dissimilarity between these countries? And these charts summarize the main thing that I find. So let's distinguish between two types of programs. One, on the left-hand side, a restrained program, one that is not optimized to make nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. This would be like Japan today, for example. Versus on the right-hand side, what I'm calling an unrestrained program, this would be like the Manhattan Project in the United States, where it's very clear that the goal of the program is to produce a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. What you're seeing here is that when you have a restrained program and one of the rivals gets nuclear latency, that in subsequent years this results in an improvement in the foreign policy congruence among the two states. And further analysis shows that this improvement is because the non-latent state is pursuing a more accommodating foreign policy towards the latent one. The substantive size of this effect is notable but relatively modest. We see about an 8 to 10% or 8 to 12% improvement in the foreign policy congruence. But on the other hand, the opposite happens if the program is unrestrained. If the program's unrestrained and one of the rivals gets nuclear latency, we see a worsening of foreign policy alignment. Substantively, it's between a 10 and 32% worsening. So again, it really is not just about the technology that you have, it's about the political intentions associated with that technology. If your intentions are restrained, you can reap this political benefit. If they're not, you can actually exacerbate tensions with your rivals and make things worse. There's a bunch of qualitative evidence in the book that complements the statistical results that I just showed you. Just to give you one anecdote here, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, talking about Iran, once wrote that nuclear latency would cause other countries to reorient their political alignment towards Tehran. And this is consistent with the results that I showed you on the previous slide. If we think that others perceived Iran's program as restrained versus unrestrained. Because once you see that shift in the political intentions, that changes the effects we observe for a country. Briefly, let me just highlight some of the other findings from the book. I show that if you have enrichment and reprocessing technology paired with political restraint, you also see a reduction in the number of international crises you experience in some years. If you're a U.S. ally, you see an increase in the number of U.S. troops on your soil. And I interpret this as these countries being able to extract stronger security guarantees from the United States by threatening to build nuclear weapons if those security guarantees are not ramped up. And in this situation, states are also able to deter rivals from arming with nuclear weapons. But if you have enrichment and reprocessing without restraint, deterrence is far less reliable. You generate a major preventive war risk, and in some cases, countries follow through with these attacks, and you're likely to incite an arms race. So, having outlined for you some of the arguments and evidence from the book, let me just tell you a little bit about why I think this matters. What have we learned? Well, I've told you about the concept of latent deterrence. I've shown you evidence that leaders try it and believe that it can be effective. We've seen some quantitative and qualitative evidence that the combination of enrichment or reprocessing with restraint can lead to success, but also that this is not a foolproof strategy, and it comes with a lot of risks. Let me highlight two policy implications that I think come out of this. The first one is, I think this should cause us to rethink what it means to be a nuclear power. We typically think about nuclear powers as the countries that have nuclear weapons. But in their own right, latent states are nuclear powers too, in the sense that they can also get some political influence and leverage from their capabilities. This is consistent with an idea that the economist Thomas Schelling expressed in a 1976 paper in International Security, where he said, from now on, it will make more sense to describe a country's nuclear weapons status not with a yes or no, but with a time schedule. And the book is very much consistent with this idea. One of the big puzzles of nuclear proliferation is why only 10 countries ever built nuclear weapons, despite the fact that many more could have done it if they wanted to. Nuclear weapons do not follow the traditional diffusion curve that other technologies have followed. And this is a big puzzle. The book offers one potential explanation for why this is happening, which is that at least some countries have been content to develop latency, not go all the way to a bomb, reap some of the political benefits that they would get from a weapon, while also dodging a lot of the costs that come with going all the way to a bomb, like, for example, economic sanctions. So it doesn't explain every case, but it helps shed light on the question of why more countries have not armed with nuclear weapons. It also has implications for disarmament. What would happen if the 10, well, there's 9 countries that have nuclear weapons today. South Africa developed them and eliminated its nuclear arsenal. So 9 have them today. What if these 9 countries decided to eliminate their nuclear weapons? At that point, we would be in a situation with a bunch of latent nuclear powers. The US and Russia and China, they would be transformed from nuclear weapon states to latent powers because they could reconstitute their weapons quickly. So by understanding the history of nuclear latency, we can get more insights about what a non-nuclear world might potentially look like. And we have to be careful here because the situation is very complex and very nuanced. So we can only reach modest conclusions here. But at the very least, I think the book gives us some reason to think that in a world without assembled nuclear weapons, that nuclear deterrence could still potentially operate. Finally, I just want to give you a sense of where I'm headed and the things I'm thinking about now that the book is concluded. One of the things I'm doing, working with Alex Debs at Yale, is to try and understand arms control, both from the standpoint of emerging technologies, but also historically. So we've collected data on all arms control treaties going back to 1816, and we think there's lessons we can learn by analyzing the history of arms control that could apply to emerging technologies today. The second thing on this slide is more kind of where I want to head in the future. I haven't broken much ground here, so to speak, but I think it's really critical to think about the intersection of AI and nuclear security, because this has the potential to upend things that we think we know about deterrence, about detection of nuclear weapons programs, and about non-proliferation. So this is on my radar too, as something that I'd like to pursue moving forward. So with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to discussion.
Please, have a seat.
Thank you.
So we'll talk a little bit and then answer questions from the audience.
Sounds good.
Great presentation, so interesting.
Thank you.
And I can see lots of intersections with things that we talk about here, and very nuanced, brilliant book. Read it this afternoon.
Great.
So anyway, let me just start out by asking you the question that I think relates to most. Oh, thank you. Oh, Jackie, thank you very much. You want to get your water too?
Yeah, why don't I do that?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? There we go, Matt.
Thanks.
Now we won't get thirsty. Appreciate that. Let's start out by talking about your data, because anytime you're talking about nuclear weapons, I mean, it's just sort of the obvious question. Where did you get your data? Much of it is secret. A lot of things are classified. How confident are you that your data is correct? You know, what do you think you have? What proportion of the best? So, where'd you get your data?
Yes, very important question. I am confident that we have captured everything almost, I want to say everything, but maybe it's almost everything, that is publicly known. But your question is getting at the possibility that there could be secret facilities about which we don't know, and maybe those then are not in the data set. We took a bunch of measures to try and mitigate this as best we could. So one thing we did is we relied on a lot of declassified documents. That's very helpful if we want to understand things happening, say, pre-1980. The CIA monitored this stuff very closely, so we found some documents that they had produced. For more recent stuff, obviously we have fewer declassified documents. The other thing we did is because we were working with people at one of the national labs, obviously on a strictly open source declassified level, but they had deep, obviously, substantive expertise, and they were helpful too to guiding us to other sources. And we made our data set publicly available, and we invited people to let us know if they know of something that isn't captured in the data set. So can we rule out the possibility? No, we can't. But the other thing I'd say is that if you all have seen Dr. Strangelove, you know that secret capabilities can't have any deterrence effect. So let's just say that there is a secret plant. Let's say, so Syria is a puzzle because they had a reactor that they were building with North Korean assistance, but apparently no reprocessing, which it doesn't make sense because there's droves of evidence that they wanted a nuclear weapon, but they would have needed both of those. So it's possible they had reprocessing. We don't have them in our data set because there's no publicly available evidence that they did. But because we're interested in deterrence, if no one knew it, then it couldn't have any deterrent value. So that gives me a little, that helps me sleep a little bit better at night, at least when it comes to understanding the deterrence dimension of this.
Okay. So something that occurred to me during your presentation, and by the way, don't you show Josh Dr. Strangelove in your course?
I do, yeah.
Politics and popcorn, okay? There's your ad. Great course. If you've not seen Dr. Strangelove, you need to go and take that course from Josh Schwartz. All right, so back to the point. One of the pictures on one of your slides is shelling, and he talks about how you need to have a sliding scale and a time series. But you can interpret that a different way, which is that he believed that there was a natural progression, and I think that was the view in the 70s, from no nuclear capability automatically to the bomb. Everybody found that attractive, but maybe what this actually means is that the value of having nuclear weapons as it used to be has diminished quite a lot. Why wouldn't that also lead to a belief that nuclear latency is a better plan?
Yeah, I think that idea is not inconsistent with the theory that I try and put forward in the book. So I think if there's a country that is facing a very, very acute security threat, that there's no better invasion insurance, in my view, than a nuclear weapon. So if a country is worried about a blitzkrieg-like invasion, like what Russia tried to execute against Ukraine, such a country is probably going to go all the way to a bomb because latency might not be seen as attractive enough strategy. But the thing is, that's not where most countries in the world are. Most countries in the world, they have some national security threats, but they're not worried about their imminent death as a country. So there's where you have the door open to the possibility of latency, where it can become more attractive because it's useful for addressing serious but not necessarily immediate threats to your existence, while also dodging some of the costs.
Okay. Well, so given that, how would you interpret the situation of Iran? Because Iran and Israel have been going back and forth, and there have been direct attacks on Iranian territory, and Iran, according to your model, has nuclear latency, if I recall correctly. That hasn't really worked. So my question is, when you say the deterrent effect, do you mean only deterrence of nuclear weapons, or are you also talking about conventional deterrence? And if so, how did you separate that?
Yeah. It's a really fascinating case that's playing it. It was a little bit nerve-wracking to publish the book before we knew how that story ended.
Not sure we still know.
We don't know still. But I think here's where the perception of the intentions of the other actor really matters. So I found lots of evidence that in the Bush and Obama administrations, there was a deterrent effect from Iran's latency. But Israel, not all Israelis, but Netanyahu and others, see Iran's intentions differently. They see Iran as bent on wanting a nuclear weapon. So once that's your view, it makes latent deterrence harder. Because one of the things you're worried about, what worried Obama and what worried George W. Bush, is that if you attack Iran, you're going to drive them to do the very thing you're trying to stop. But if you already think they're trying to do that full throttle, then there's no risk of accelerating the program because you think they're going to try and arm anyways. So I would explain that in terms of different perceptions of what Iran's intentions were.
Okay, but Israel's not the only country that needs to worry about Iran potentially having a nuclear weapon. So getting aside from Israeli perceptions, what do you think the reality is with respect to Iran now having been attacked despite nuclear latency? Do you think, many people in other words are arguing that this is going to increase the incentives for the Iranian regime to go ahead and build a bomb?
Yeah, I think there are some, so I should say I don't know for sure because I'm only observing this as an outsider. But from the conversations I've had with people, my impression is that some in Iran are now reaching the conclusion that they don't think the latency strategy has paid off because they see that they're now sanctioned, so that they're incurring a lot of costs that normally we associate with getting nuclear weapons. And there was a time when they saw a political benefit from latency, but as their national security has been more threatened in recent months, that perception has become eroded, I think, to some degree. So there are some in Iran who are maybe more predisposed towards a hawkish or hardline approach who think that Iran should just go all the way to a bomb. And that argument seems to be carrying some water. We don't know what they're going to do because I do think there's still others who are arguing that latency is the better strategy still. But when you see deterrence fail, as it did from Iran's perspective recently, that might make you question what you should do moving forward.
Interesting. Great. Well, let me shift just a little bit and talk about some emerging technologies and the effects of some of the advances that have been more recent than nuclear technology. So why necessarily are we worried about nuclear latency if you can have a cyber attack that completely destroys your infrastructure and makes you helpless in terms of governing your country? Or perhaps you've got targeting that can take out a lot of your leaders or even many of your military personnel, especially because there's a very huge database that can therefore find out exactly where they are, and it's almost impossible to hide. So why do you even need nuclear weapons if you can have an intact country and use much more advanced capabilities instead? How does this fit into the framework, or does it?
Yeah, I think the world's changing, as you well know, and technological change is causing us to rethink a lot of our traditional theories, which is intellectually very interesting, but from a policy standpoint presents a lot of challenges. The way I think about it is you think about the technologies you have kind of like an investment portfolio where you're diversified in your technologies because certain tools you have in the toolkit are going to be more useful in some situations versus others. So Are there situations where the ability to carry out or threaten to carry out a cyber attack would be more effective politically than a nuclear attack? Yeah, I think so.
Maybe you actually want to have a territory that's still intact,
right,
to be able to control.
Yeah, but there's also, I think, at the same time, situations where a nuclear weapon is sort of unparalleled in terms of its deterrent advantages.
How about hypersonics? Because they can be either nuclear or conventional.
Yeah. This can present some difficult challenges as well. We got to think about missile defense as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not. It's dynamic, and it's. I want to be careful not to make sort of broad generalizations because things are changing very rapidly.
Okay. So, a question about domestic factors. You talk about this a little bit in the book, but I don't fully understand. How did you take into account things like the domestic political pressures that you mentioned briefly in a country like Japan, where Article 9 of its constitution says that they are not to be militarily, they're not to have a military, so they have a self-defense force. And also they've got the traumatic history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you've got both political factors and legal factors that both argue against having any kind of capability to go to the bomb. So maybe it's not the effectiveness of their foreign policy as a nuclear latent power. It's very, very strong impacts of domestic factors. And there are other countries that I could use, but that's the most stark.
Yeah.
How did you adjust for that in your statistical analysis?
Yeah. So those things are very real. In Japan, there's lots of domestic constraints, I believe. So the way I sort of, what the theory would say, and I use the theory to try and guide how I do the empirical analysis, is that anything that makes it more costly for the latent power to implement its threat is going to potentially make that threat less believable. So in a case like Japan or anywhere else where there's reasons to doubt whether they would actually build a nuclear weapon, that means that the situations under which latent deterrence is going to be useful is going to be narrower. So it would have to, and this is where the high stakes come in as part of the theory. It would have to be, if Japan said to China, if you fly drones over our country, we're going to build nuclear weapons. It's just that's not credible because of the costs that Japan would incur domestically and internationally for doing that. But if it was a more major national security threat on the table, then maybe in that situation it becomes more plausible that Japan might follow through. I mean, yes, there are all these domestic constraints, but what would happen to public opinion in Japan if the country was actually attacked with North Korean missiles? I think that would change a lot of the domestic conversation, and some of the constraints that were in place previously might go away or be reduced.
All right, so that leads to the last question that I'm going to ask and give everybody else a chance, which is about the geopolitics and the impact of other kinds of international factors. We talked about domestic. Let's go to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of change. The easiest one probably is to talk about the impact of China on the strategies that are being developed in South Korea and also in Japan, and slightly more interest or potentially more incentive to balance by having nuclear capabilities. And how does that fit into the theory that nuclear latency is more effective, or how would that fit into your framework? How do you adjust to the geopolitics?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is that it's interesting because latent deterrence can be used both against adversaries and allies. So Japan and South Korea have used this against the U.S. to try and extract stronger security guarantees historically. Now, the thing in terms of geopolitics, one thing I'm watching very closely is what happens if those countries begin to question whether the United States would defend them if they are attacked, and we see a weakening of those alliance relationships. Or if we see the U.S. government shift its longstanding policy in terms of opposing nuclear proliferation by allies and saying, well, we don't care as much if Japan or South Korea gets nuclear weapons. If that were to happen, then the ability to coerce the U.S. by threatening to build nuclear weapons would lose its value. And so we'd be in a world where those countries would be thinking about not so much coercing allies, but trying to coerce adversaries. And then we have to ask ourselves, would that strategy work? And I think, there's good reasons to think that it might. It might work if you can cultivate the impression that you're not racing to build a bomb.
Fascinating. Okay, well, I'll ask for volunteers for questions from the audience. Nadia.
Thank you so much.
Can we wait for the mic, please? And also, as you, yes, please, if you don't mind, stand up, and if you could briefly explain who you are, everybody, when you ask a question, I'd appreciate that.
Hi. Okay, hi, I'm Nadia Kostyuk. I'm a faculty at CMIST. I joined in the fall. Excited to be here. Thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. So my question is related to the data and analysis component. So how do you know that the countries' rivalries know about the program, right? So is it the assumption that a lot of them are the U.S. allies and they share intelligence, given that they have a lot of different intelligence capabilities? At least from what I saw from your site, like how far back in terms of years do you lag your DV and IV to study that relationship? Because if it's only 1 year, it's kind of a strong assumption to know that they have this possibility. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I want to answer it in two ways, I think. The first thing I'll say is that when I started this project, it was a heavily quantitative project. And in the end, it was heavily qualitative and much less quantitative. And part of the reason for that is as I got more and more into it, I realized that issues like the one you're raising are difficult to deal with in a quantitative way. So I leaned more and more on the qualitative historical component to get at this question. So for the quantitative tests, I'm making an assumption that if I'm able to identify the facility, that was known in real time to other countries. I adjust for 3 lags. Well, there's a bunch of robustness tests with different lag structures, but in what I showed you, that's adjusted for 3 lags. So that gives me a little bit of confidence there. And then the other thing I'd say is, especially U.S. intelligence has been pretty good. There's been some highly publicized misses, but in general, countries with sophisticated intelligence agencies have been quite successful in identifying these facilities. They're hard to hide, especially a reactor or a reprocessing plant, because they use so much energy. So countries have been pretty adept at being able to detect them. There's probably, I'm sure, of the many observations in the data set, I'm quite confident that there are some in there where an adversary didn't know. I know of one off the top of my head. Israel completely missed what Libya was up to as far as some of the experimental work it was doing. And someone from their intelligence services later said it was because they weren't watching Libya. They were watching Syria, they were watching Iran, they were watching other places. They didn't even have resources devoted to it because they didn't suspect anything. So there are misses, but I think they're probably not that many and not enough to really sway the broad patterns that we see in the data. And then even if there were, because there's qualitative evidence as well that speaks to that, that gives me more peace of mind.
I actually think the case studies are at least I really, really enjoyed the case studies quite a lot. I strongly recommend the book for the case studies too. Ignacio?
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. Ignacio Arana, I'm a CMIST assistant professor. I'm a comparativist. And I want to ask you, because the deterrence effects are very different whether we are talking about restrained or unrestrained enrichment programs, right? So that, I think, it's key. So how can you really distinguish them? if it's so much based on perceptions, as you yourself described. You said the US and Israel see the Iranian program from different perspectives. And we're talking about two countries that have excellent intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
So if it's conditional on perception, then how can you really distinguish them with confidence?
Right. Yeah, important issue. Josh and I were talking about this a little bit in our meeting earlier. So I took a two-pronged approach here. First, quantitatively, I came up with some criteria that I thought were representative of what a credible restraint posture looks like. And then I personally coded each case based on the objective reality. But of course, the objective reality can be different from how it's perceived. So for the quantitative tests, I can't really distinguish between perception and reality. I think if I had unlimited resources, I could, but what it would require is just deep, deep historical analysis on every dyad. So it'd be very labor intensive. And so the approach I took in the book is to say, well, for the quantitative part, I'm going to code it based on some objective criteria. People can disagree maybe with some of the codings, but at least the criteria are clearly laid out. And then for the qualitative part, that's where I can really get at the intention. So again, this is another reason why the qualitative part of the book became so much more important the deeper I got into the project. Because, yeah, perceptions, that's difficult to get at quantitatively.
Okay, the right side of the room is knocking it out of the park here, folks, but the left side needs to, Baruch, please.
Hi, I'm Baruch Fischoff, a professor in CMIST and the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. So some years ago, I was on a committee with somebody who was working on the body in The Hague that implements the chemical weapons treaty. And when once he was saying, he said, well, at some point, he thought there were certain things the Soviet Union could no longer do. It hadn't maintained its capability because changes in its training, in the tacit knowledge of its workforce, and the industrial capability that provided the feedstock. So while you were talking, and then in your response to Audrey's question, I was wondering, well, how hard is it to maintain a capability? You've got to train people, you've got to have this tacit knowledge, and so on. And, you know, does it just become so hard that you shift your portfolio to other things? Assuming that you don't have a lobby that wants to keep the bucks coming to keep the weapons facilities going.
Right, yeah. So one of the things that I think is interesting is to think about is, let's say you once had a large-scale reprocessing capability in the 60s, but you shut it down in, say, 1970. Does that give you leverage in 1980? And where I come down on this is to say that it doesn't. And the reason is, well, it could give you some, but not as much as if you have the actual operational facilities, because this is like a costly signal. It's like a shot across the bow when you're actively making enriched uranium or plutonium. Once you shut that down, the signal you send to everybody else is, we're not interested in this path anymore, which weakens the credibility of the threat to potentially make a bomb at some point if your security is threatened. So what I found is that having an active enrichment and reprocessing program is different from having a program previously and then shuttering it, for the reasons you're pointing to. Once you lose the tacit knowledge and the human capital, it becomes harder to threaten to reconstitute.
Dan.
Better for everybody that I can spread my wings here. Hi, Dan Silverman. I'm an assistant professor in CMIST, and I focus on conflict and Middle East primarily. Two quick questions, if I may.
Short.
They'll be punchy. One, why don't more states do it? If you laid out this logic, the graph you showed, it was like, you know, you said that the latency curve was above the use or the active programs, or active weapons, 15, you know, and then you get 17. You add it up. That's not much of the world. So why are more states not using this very advantageous strategy for deterring the rivals and getting political and economic leverage? And then two, I was curious for your thoughts, to think a little more sort of horizontally about this. I was trying to do it while you spoke, but obviously you've probably done it much more. So, I don't know, what do you think of the concept of latency more generally? How much, what should we think, how do we think about the ability of states and non-state actors to sort of have the threat of proliferation and development of technologies, of new potentially military technologies of all sorts, whether those be whatever, from drones, which you've studied, to militarized nanotechs or drone swarms, whatever you want to say, AI in different ways, or how unique is nuclear weapons, and what are the factors that make latency be a bigger or smaller threat? Yeah,
great. So in terms of why more countries don't do this, one of the reasons is that for this strategy to really make any sense, you have to have a nuclear energy program. Because if you don't have reactors and you're developing enrichment, that is the most suspicious thing you could possibly do. So no country's going to follow that. No country's going to do that. So, there's low 30s in terms of the number of countries that have nuclear power plants in operation. That's kind of a minimum threshold for being able to think about a fuel production capability. So it's not that other countries wouldn't be interested, it's that the fact that you need a reasonably sized nuclear energy program limits the pool of countries that could viably pull this off. That's why, how interested was Iran in nuclear energy in the 80s and 90s? I'm not sure, but they had to build that Bashir nuclear power plant to make its enrichment program seem like it was not optimized to make a bomb, right? So that can be a significant constraint. I'm excited about thinking about latency as a more general concept, not just nuclear. There's no reason to think it would only apply to nuclear. I was participating in a conference at the Woodrow Wilson Center in DC, and that was on what they called strategic latency, which includes nuclear but is broader. And so there are people thinking about this outside the nuclear realm, and I think that's a promising area for future research. If you think about where I started talking about the sources of military power, a lot of that comes from underlying commercial, technological, economic capabilities that are not necessarily weaponized but could be weaponized. So, my intuition is just that if you have those capabilities, that's valuable in international politics. And I think it would be great to explore that in a more deep way.
Do you have thoughts on where we should be most worried about latency? Which kinds of technologies?
Yeah, so I would gravitate towards the technologies that are the most disruptive when thinking about latency. So what makes nuclear latency, I think, interesting is just one of the reasons is that the destructive potential of the technology is so great that we really need to understand how having the underlying capacity could be important. So I would think about, Audrey was talking about how you could cause a lot of damage with cyber and other things. I would gravitate towards the kinds of attacks that are potentially the most disruptive, and then think about latency, how it could work in those contexts.
Okay, we're at time, but there is one more question from the left side of the room. This is the last one. I feel obliged to let the left side have the last question.
Hi, I'm Sathwika, and I'm an undergraduate in statistics here at CMU. So you talked a little bit about the deterrent effects of restrained and unrestrained nuclear programs, and then we talked a little bit about the difference in perceptions of Iran's program. So do you think that there is a value for deterrence when there's deliberate ambiguity or strategic ambiguity in whether a country's nuclear program is restrained or unrestrained, and just if you could expand on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really important issue, and I think it speaks to the concept that I call deterrence by doubt, which is not my term. Some economists coined that in a 2004 paper, I think, and I'm using their terminology because I think it's a useful way of thinking about this. But strategic ambiguity, more or less what you're saying there is, if you create uncertainty about what exactly you have, that might have a deterrent effect. And I think that it could. So in 1991, the CIA concluded that there was a 50-50 chance North Korea already had 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. We know in hindsight that that wasn't true. But at the time, that's what the CIA said. So imagine you're the president. In 1994, the United States almost launched a military attack against North Korea in a very serious crisis. So imagine you're the president at that time, and your intelligence agency is saying there's a 50-50 chance they already have 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. Would that influence you? That would influence me. In deterrence, if the consequences are great, you don't have to threaten certainty. If there's only a 50 or even 40 or 30 or 20% chance that something bad would happen, if that bad thing is really, really bad, that might cause you to be deterred. So, the evidence on that North Korean case is a bit murky, but just as a conceptual example, I think it's interesting for illuminating the concept that you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you all for great questions, and thank you, Dr. Fuhrmann, for a terrific presentation.
Thank you.